you all to this second webinar in a series of 5 on the topic of raising venture capital with impact. For those that are joining us for the first time, I am Luisa Ferreira and I'm head of the social at European Investment Bank Institute. One quick word on the Institute: we are the philanthropic arm of the EIB, the EU policy bank. And I will be your host for today's webinar. And we have 3 guests: Wladimir Nikoluk, and he will be the speaker in all the 5 webinars. And you will be joined by Viet Lee, is an investment manager at La Famiglia, an early stage VC fund, and Ines Streimelweger, I have a hard time pronouncing her name, and Ines is an investment manager at CREANDUM, a VC fund as well. Just a quick word on Wladimir. Wladimir is the CEO and founder of ImmerLearn, and ImmerLearn is an advanced analytics consultancy firm that helps entrepreneurs and managers and investors, to manage and increase their impact. Wladimir has got his BA from Oxford and then an MP from the Harvard Kennedy School. He has spent some time at McKinsey and at the United Nations in Jordan, and he's also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Shapers. Our objective with these 5 webinars is to explore how entrepreneurs can use in a successful way impact measurement to raise funding from existing and emerging venture capital funds. 2 weeks ago, Wladimir kicked off with an introduction of the topic, and this week he will deep dive into how traditional VC funds are now building impact verticals. So what we see is that in recent years, some funds that were not traditionally known for impact focus created some capital pockets that are focusing on areas like climate, clean tech, food, health, and education. And his 2 guests today will be talking about that. Before I give the mic to the 3 guests, a couple of logistic remarks. One is the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available in a few days in the Institute YouTube channel, where you can also find the recording of the first webinar on the series and all the other webinars we've been developing for the SIT alumni and other social entrepreneurs. The second one is a technical one, and if you have any issues with your audio, please make sure it's connected or just rejoin the call. Usually it solves the problems. You have several ways to interact with us. If you have questions to ask from any of the 3 panelists today, please use chat and use the option send to all panelists so we can manage the questions. And finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll be asking you to answer a short survey. So thank you. And now I invite Wladimir, Viet, and Ines to join us and on this topic today.
Fantastic. Lisa, thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to continue this webinar series with 2 amazing European funds we have, and 2 colleagues who represent those funds, Ines and Viet. Just a quick overview of the agenda we have. Start with a quick round of introductions for both Viet and Ines in a bit. Then we're going to do a quick recap on the material we covered in the last session, so the trends that really drive some of the interest in investing in impactful companies, and how that might have incentivized VCs to actually engage with those companies. Then we're going to focus first on CREANDUM's perspective on investing in those type of companies, and then second of all on La Familia's perspective. And then we're going to do a series of deep dives. So the first deep dive is going to be on analyzing impactful companies. So how do you define impact, and how do you distinguish between companies who have or who don't have impact? The second deep dive is on the topic of supply. Where are those companies coming from, and where does the demand for them come from? And then the third deep dive is on the relationship between impact and the company value. Is there a way in which impact can actually increase or decrease the value of a company, and how do investors see that? And lastly, we're gonna close kind of the formal part of the discussion with a quick kind of note on what investors should actually know about what VCs actually look for when thinking about investing in companies. So with this in mind, I'd love to invite our two speakers, Ines and Viet, to just briefly introduce themselves personally before we move on to the funds.
Very, very cool. Vlad, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Very exciting to be here. As a brief introduction, yeah, I'm based or Zooming or WebExing in from Berlin today. I'm part of CREANDUM's investment team. So we focus on seed and Series A across Europe. So that means usually ticket sizes from 500,000 to probably around 12 in the initial round. And we have done so for the past, 17, 18 years. So we come in very much as a traditional VC with a super broad focus on probably 50% B2B and 50% B2C. So that's health, consumer, tech, fintech, insurtech, like literally covering the whole range. And prior to joining, I was actually part of Rocket Internet and BCG Digital Ventures for a while. So focusing more on building ventures from scratch and working with the management boards at both firms. And it was actually back at BCG DV that people start to ask the question, everyone talks about impact, but what does impact really mean? It was the big topic at Davos. It was, literally in every meeting, someone was asking for it. And within the partnership, the discussion was always, we built so many ventures, we must be doing good, but how can we make it measurable? And what does it mean? And how can we set objectives and make sure that we actually change our ways of doing stuff for the better? And that's been my primary motivation when I joined CREANDUM's investment team, to say, hey, there gotta be solutions out there to answer that question. So yeah, fast forward, excited to be discussing more of this today.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Ines.
Super cool. Hi, Wladimir. Thanks for organizing. Luisa, thanks for the great introduction. And yeah, thanks for letting me me having the opportunity to basically participate in this great talk with you, Ines, and Wladimir. And so my name is Viet. I work at La Famiglia, which is a Berlin-based venture capital. We focus on seed stage, relatively similar to CREANDUM. We are currently in our second fund right now, which is around 60 million. Invested in 40 plus companies, very vertical agnostic. So I think like the typical La Famiglia portfolio company would be a B2B and software company, so similar to Personio, Photo, or like in France, Spaceville, Agricool, Sweep, and many more across Europe as well as the US. So I think like this is like one of the cool things about La Famiglia, that we are one of the few funds that have like a strong footprint in both geographies. Yeah, I love everything like around B2B software. Sometimes we do consumer, sometimes we do hardware too. Personally, I love everything around data-driven and machine learning-driven companies. So my background is in data science. I initially worked as a data scientist in the product team at Amazon Munich. Worked on a couple of classifiers there, but with Amazon had a tremendous impact. Also, yeah, part of the CD10, which is a joint institution of the two Munich universities. And there I basically got in contact with sustainability, as a possible way to basically, start a company initially. So like one of my friends, a developer friend at CD10, just, one day asked me, Viet, like with all those, good education and privilege we have, like, why is everybody basically joining McKinsey, Googles of the world? Like, why don't we just like join forces? And, found a company in the sustainability space. So basically I had a little bit of exposure and founding myself, but then I decided like, it wasn't the best for me during that time. So I rejoined La Famiglia again, and now working full time with La Famiglia, and added sustainability thanks to my friends who brought attention to that topic to one of our core thesis. But more on that a little bit later.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Viet, and excited to be discussing this with both of you. So very quick recap of the last session, just to set a little bit the stage for both kind of our listeners and ourselves on the type of trends that we discussed. So first, we kind of distinguished impact. We said that impact investing is something that, can have many definitions and sometimes is actually used widely, like negative screens, ESG integration, positive screening. But I think for us, maybe like an impactful company could be something that generates positive, measurable social and or environmental impact alongside kind of financial return. And one of the interesting things about this type of investing is that it has grown quite a lot, actually by a factor of 90 since the last 8 years. So from 8 billion to 15 billion. So this is not only VC, this is just generally what we might consider like kind of rigorous impact investing. And we identified that one of the sources of demand for those companies might be actually the kind of also a little bit the imperfections of our world, right? The concentration of CO2 is at an 800,000 year high. There are rising sea levels. The resource demand that we have kind of would actually correspond to 5 planets. Rising inequality, there's mental health challenges, there's poverty challenges. So all of those things seem to be quite far away from the type of targets we set ourselves as codified in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, I think, the world's, in a way, language to speak to the desirable state where we actually want to be. We also identified that there's quite a gap in actually reaching SDGs, 2.5 trillion a year. And the question was a little bit like, well, where will this come from? Who will create those scalable solutions? And we ended up actually discussing as well the type of kind of reaction that other stakeholders have, right? From governments creating new legislation, from consumers in a way adapting their consumption preferences, to corporations adopting kind of emerging impact standards. So you kind of see that the world kind of seems to be taking note of the challenges at hand, and there is this change in behavior. And of course, there's always this question about like, to what extent is it sincere? To what extent, is it not like a lot of impact washing as well? But it seems that there is quite some market kind of demand for scalable solutions to some of the challenges we face. And then we dove a little bit into the preferences of millennials. Like we noted that they're much more likely to work for companies or companies that correspond more in alignment with their values. We had a deep dive on some of the companies that resulted from kind of young talent or talent trying to solve impact-related problems, like, for example, Zipline, which does drone delivery for vital medical goods, or Tala, which does microloans for the underbanked. And we actually realized that they have quite a huge valuations by now, right? So Zipline is now worth, I think, 1.3 billion. Tala is now worth 800 million. Indigo, which does microbiology to increase crop yield, is 3.5 billion now. So quite some kind of value that was actually created by solving actually impactful problems. And we actually ended up a little bit looking at the funds, the fund size, where we obviously mentioned both of your funds as well, so CREANDUM and La Famiglia, and looked at, essentially at like 2 categories. So one was the more traditional, I guess, like classical kind of VC funds that are sector agnostic and that have now started to focus on those verticals a little bit more. And then second of all, funds that kind of emerge that are exclusively focused on one of the impact vertical and kind of didn't exist in this form beforehand. We lastly looked at some exciting impact management and measurement approaches that emerged, from the kind of impact multiple of money to a framework around essentially the IIB project to lastly one published. And kind of left it there as a setup, right? To kind of have the trends, the companies, the impact measurement frameworks, and the funds. And so now maybe as a next, like taking off from here, Ines, it would be fantastic to just understand. You wrote, you work for CREANDUM, you've invested in quite a few kind of are actually quite impactful. And you've actually published a kind of acclaimed post on how CREANDUM actually sees, I think, specifically sustainability. So maybe you could comment a little bit on CREANDUM's position on, how you see impactful companies, how you define impact, and what it means for you to invest in an impactful company.
Yeah, all very good questions. So perhaps I guess a general disclaimer, right? Like CREANDUM is a generalist VC. Like we invest in companies that we think can have a super successful outcome, become, industry leaders, redefine the industries that they're in, etc. So I think in the past years, we've come across companies that probably today we might label as climate tech related companies, such as Nuco Foods, who work on plant-based cheese, and Twice, which is a battery analytics startup. So we do have these investments, but we didn't set out to say, hey, we now focus on climate tech and what companies can we back. I think that's more we see this as an evolution, that companies that we see out there actually in general want to do more good, and that happens to be within that category. And I think as a journalist, we see like we know the importance of these topics very well, and it's exciting because we get to do our job and we also get to hopefully do good down the line. But I think sometimes we also have to be a little bit almost careful, because the GPs that have been, or the partners that have been with the firm, for 10, 12 years have also seen the boom and bust of the first climate tech hype. And I think they're some of them are even a little careful when it comes to climate tech, because they've seen where things can go. And I think recently, the last year, we've seen such an uptick in activity and in funds flowing into this area that, I think naturally we want to be part of it. That said, we're not like some other funds looking at USV or Pale Blue Dot or Übermorgen. We see that have actually started dedicated funds that focus on climate tech related companies only. We're generalists, and especially I within the team look at a lot of these topics, but it's almost like we see a lot of activity happening. We believe in the field, so we want to be part of it, but it's not like we're going to exclusively focus on climate tech only.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And
does that answer your question, Vlad?
Yeah, fantastic. That's great. And maybe one quick follow-up on what type of maybe kind of like data, or like what type of patterns did you see that actually made you in a way focus on those companies and kind of wants you to like increases that desire to be part of this trend and take advantage of it?
So I think one is like general awareness that like we need to start acting. Full stop. And I think the second is that we see a lot of pressures work in that way. Like you see increasing regulatory demand. We see that LPs, so that means limited partners who invest into venture funds, are increasingly asking for this. And we see a lot of repeat founders moving into the field, and starting climate-related companies. So we just see a lot of activity, and I think probably the first wave that at least I've been noticing throughout all of last year was a lot of companies related to decarbonizing our economy. So from measuring how much we emit to trying and change our behavior, all the way to offsetting the carbon that we emit on a B2B and also B2C level. And Vlad, you're right. I did pick up on that on a blog post and tried to just understand the market and try and understand, what do we see and how can we make sense of it? And is there an opportunity for VC to go into it? And I'm sure Viet also has probably similar views, but we do primarily focus on software. Sometimes there's some hardware involved because you just need you have software that is enabled by hardware. We see a lot of that in climate tech, and I think VCs are getting more comfortable with that, but traditionally have been a bit more reserved. Like the more hardware involved, the more careful we probably are.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Perfect. And Viet, maybe that's a great way to also kind of turn the attention a little bit to how La Famiglia does it. So could you maybe like explain your position? How did you raise your second fund now? Does it have a sustainability focus, and how are you looking at the sector?
Yeah, sure. I think I can only echo what Ines said. A lot of true words in that, and so similarly to CREANDUM, we are also a generalist fund who I think to be quite frank, didn't start out with the first fund of having the core focus of sustainability. I think it naturally evolved with I think like with the public attention, and I think like, you know, hands down, Fridays for Future like contributed, you know, a lot to the like the whole ecosystem, the awareness among consumers. And I believe like my hypothesis back in the days when I, you know, tried to found something in the sustainability sector was that, you know, consumer will move first and will pull B2B and as well as regulatories. And regulatories in turn will pull B2B in that and force into that field. And so I think like it was a lot of, you know, different tailwinds which brought La Famiglia into that sustainability sector eventually with the second fund. So the second fund was set up, you know, in the course of 2019, 2020. And then when I returned, I just like made it the, you know, one of the part focus of La Famiglia. And so like how we see it at La Famiglia, looking at sustainability, and I know that sustainability is only, you know, one part of the impact, but you know, this is like the only like small window I can give to you right now, like, you know, given the genesis of like where we come from. It's like basically within sustainability, we have three focus areas. So one is basically getting the insights into like the amount and the drivers of, you know, how much carbon emissions a company basically have. Especially, I think like where it's interesting is in established industries, because like we see a lot of movement when it comes to, you know, B2B and early adopters, like for example, you know, SaaS companies that try to measure and offset, and of course, like, you know, give reduction measures and recommendations to very modern companies. But I think like, you know, the dirty picks out there are the more established ones. And so like we are very much interested to find a company that could potentially achieve that. And so we recently made an investment in France in that field. And also one of our companies and from the first fund, Craft, has, you know, pivoted more into, you know, supply chain intelligence in order to also see like, you know, potentially uncover scope 2, scope 3 type of carbon emissions. And I think like it's also very interesting with regards to you know, the tailwinds with the Lieferanten Gesetz and Lieferantenkettengesetz in Germany. And so that's the first one. The second one would be basically like, once you have like the insights of the carbon emissions in the company, what would be, you know, the measures in order to basically reduce it. And it can be, you know, very hardware heavy. And this is like also like similarly to CREANDUM, where we say like, you know, that probably hardware is not our sweet spot, so we focus on software first. And there, we from our first fund, we did an investment in Alchemy, basically a machine learning product that tries to reduce, you know, carbon emissions when it comes to cement and concrete production. And I think like along, you know, that kind of setting, there's so many things to do to basically you know, reduce carbon. And I think like with the third pillar of the sustainability angle, how we see it is basically, you know, once you ideally removed everything, like what happens. And I think like one aspect to it would be the infrastructure layer of offsetting. And so we love companies in that space that, you know, think about carbon finance. So for example, Silvera, Pachama, or Ryzac in France is a very good example. And, you know, other players in the infrastructure layer. And I think like these are the three pillars that we are, you know, currently focusing on. Very software heavy, of course, because that's our genesis as La Famiglia. And yeah, that's the sustainability angle. When it comes to social, I think like, you know, with us having 2 female partners, and diversity and inclusion is like a very, very important topic for us too. But that might be for another time. I think I spoke a lot right now. So heading back to you, Vlad, for the next question.
No, thank you so much. And I think if I put this together, I would say like there are some kind of natural trends that are driven by, you know, various stakeholders' interest in solving some of those kind of issues that we face as a society, as a community, maybe even as a planet. And then out of those, there are those kind of emerging things for emitting less carbon or offsetting or calculating kind of some indicators that we want to manage essentially. But those companies, and I think what you're also saying is those are naturally good companies to invest in. I mean, so far they, even for some reason, if they didn't have any impact, and if they maybe couldn't, like, you know, if they it would be kind of maybe less karma positive to invest in them. But you might still be interested to do so because they're just businesses, they scale, they create the financial returns for the funds that you actually want to see. So maybe kind of moving on to this next question is
maybe Vlad, may I just jump in very quickly? I think there's one additional component. So I don't think every company necessarily has to be a sustainability related or climate tech company, but one thing that VC funds do increasingly look out for is measuring ESG within our portfolio, right? So that means even if you build, I don't know, a workflow tool or the next Zoom or something out there, we still want to make sure that you follow certain guidelines to make sure you build a diverse team from the early outset. We hope you have a travel policy in place and that you're aware of your carbon emissions. So I think that's an element on top. So it's A, the type of company invest in, but then also B, how these companies are managed and making sure we at least encourage them and try to lead by example of setting up sustainable companies in the long term as they grow.
Fantastic, that sounds great. And Viet, could you confirm, would you have a similar system in place like CREANDUM for your companies, or is it still very discretionary for your portfolio?
So I mean, like to be quite frank, like we haven't put a system in place where we can basically automatically, measure metrics along the ESG dimensions. To be perfectly frank, I would love to use at least like along the E dimension, I would love to use the product of one of our portfolio companies, but they're like still building. But nevertheless, I think like, for example, Leaders for Climate Action, this is like initiative driven by some digital entrepreneurs and decision makers in Germany. They put a great effort in basically, creating the awareness and also putting a lot of good measures in place. Like, for example, they were one of the core drivers of the sustainability clause, which we implemented in our term sheets, and which kind of like, I wouldn't say force, but suggests that portfolio companies act in a sustainable manner.
Gotcha, that makes sense. And I think like putting those together, so ESG is obviously a really important first step when it comes to understanding the impact of companies, right? I mean, in a way, impact, it asks the first step of impact, which is, are you responsible in a way participant and entity in various environments in your community, to your workers, to the way you treat your planet, to the way you treat your customers. And then after that, there is this maybe like this a second step that kind of might be kind of what is the positive or negative impact of consuming the goods and services on the kind of on the planet, if you will, or on various stakeholders. Is this something that you would kind of measure or look at as well?
You mean, would this product or service help me still consume a certain product, but do that in a more sustainable way?
Yeah, or for example, or even if you would, for example, have you would invest in an education technology company, right? And they would say, well, look, we educate people and we help them find jobs. Would you try to quantify the positive impact that this company would actually have in the world, or would you say like, no, I think we like if they just grow, we know that there is some impact. We can't quite quantify it, but we know it's actually positive.
No, I think similar to Viet, we're currently working on a methodology to figure these things out and to make them measurable in a way that's also comparable across portfolio companies. But to give a specific example, we're also backers of Voi, so one of the e-scooter startups out there. And I think it's a very polarizing discussion. Some would say, how can this be climate tech and how can this be good? But on the other hand, like people would still need to travel from A to B, and they might have jumped into a car before, and now they jump on an e-scooter, which doesn't emit as much CO2. And by replacing or giving people more options in their everyday to like use transportation that's greener, we do think that's a KPI that you can make measurable. We currently don't, but we're working on finding the right methodology and implementing it.
Got you. Okay, that makes so much sense. And could you just say, if you have, like, say, a company that you kind of expect to be good on the ESG side and to actually have a positive impact, either in an environmental or social manner, would you treat them any differently than any of your other companies? I mean, would you maybe be a little bit more lenient on how much financial return they have to generate for you? Is there some kind of trade-off that you're willing to make, or do you, or would that not be the case?
I mean, so for us, like, I wish we did, but unfortunately, like the bar for CREANDUM to invest still is basically the same, right? It has to be a company with an amazing team, with an amazing opportunity, with a market that is huge or will be huge in the future. And some traction is also never does harm. But I do think that we see investment rounds happening out there that happen at increasing sizes because funds want to do climate bets and they jump on opportunities. Although it's perhaps, it might be a strong team, but it's based on a slide deck and we do have questions, but for the, benefit of the doubt, people are willing to lean in. I personally believe sometimes it is to like have a tick in a box and say, hey, we have done a couple of climate investments. But yeah, I would say the bar doesn't change. And also once invested, like we have the same expectations of our portfolio companies to perform as with any other firm.
Yeah.
I think the good part of, being in the same panel like Ines and like having a very like similarly focused to CREANDUM is that I can only echo like what she said. So pretty much like we are also like a generalist fund, right? And I think like the bar doesn't change at all, like whether it's like a sustainability or like a impact focused company or not. It's basically still like, we're in the quote unquote business of returning the fund pretty much. And I think like there would be no difference. But if like, for example, Alchemy is put it as one of their emissions, like for example, they want to reduce carbon by X amount in 2025, for sure in every board meeting, we track against it. We track against it, like how well does the machine learning product work already and what's the potential? Because like that's like, clearly stated as their, a North Star. Clearly incorporated in one of their OKRs, and so like for sure we definitely do that. But I think like if you don't particularly are a company within that realm like Alchemy or that French company, then it's like that's still like the typical VC criteria, VC metrics, VC KPIs you're basically tracking and looking at.
That makes sense. And here, maybe we can have like a flowing kind of back and forth between Q&A questions, because there are some really interesting ones being asked and the topics we had in the beginning. But one of the questions is the way you actually then at least do the ESG kind of tracking, right? I think maybe Ines, that's more a question for you. So which ESG factors do you actually use, and how do you in a way collect them and track them? Like do you have like a system in place? Is it like an Excel sheet? Is it quarterly? Is it yearly? And what actually happens if the ESG performance maybe goes down? And like, could there be any consequences for the company as a result?
Yeah, I think these are all excellent questions, and many questions to which I think as of today we don't actually have clear answers. It's very much work in progress. I think the first step for us is actually similar to I think La Famiglia, to have integrated certain questions we ask already as part of the like DD process. So before we decide to invest, like we have a question in our timesheet recommendation that says, hey, what's actually the diversity of the team? And we look at for certain parameters, and we have a diversity clause in our term sheet. These are things that we are starting to integrate. And then once we have invested, this is actually a huge ongoing project within CREANDUM. It sits with our legal team because the LPs are asking for it, trying to figure out what are the KPIs across our portfolio that we should measure, what should be implemented early on. So you make sure that the companies already kind of are set up for success as they grow larger. How can the portfolio learn from each other, and how can we make this measurable, trackable in a way that is also not too much of a burden for the companies? And oftentimes in the beginning you don't have the data. So it's lots of questions that are flying around, and there's actually a whole community within the VC world trying to tackle this topic at large. So you have like WhatsApp groups, and like there's actually a call following this one where different VCs discuss how they go about tracking ESG and what tools they use and what frameworks they use, and so many questions. So I think it's a perfect time to actually get into the space and say, hey, I have an idea how to solve this.
Okay, there's a startup idea immediately for the participants. Exactly. Excellent.
Yeah.
Perfect. And would you maybe, I mean, one definition, one way that sometimes people think about responsible investing is also in terms of not investing in kind of harmful products, right? Like, I mean, so-called negative screens. Is there a way to consider that in your funds, where you say like we exclude certain industries from investments? Maybe it's kind of weapons manufacturing or certain drugs. Like, how do you handle that?
I think like I can quickly jump in with a quick answer. So basically, we have an agreement with our LPs in turn that we kind of like promised never to basically invest in drugs, never invest in weapons, and all these typical dimensions, and also like of course, update our LPs on our sectors basically, and also like saying that sustainability is basically been added to one of our focus areas. We will actively look out for it, and we'll actively make investments out of it. And I think like to also like your previous questions when it comes to how to basically measure ESG ourselves. I think like we've never, like what's interesting, and I've never thought about this, is like basically since ESG is like such a great framework to use, I've never thought, like to be frank, I never thought of actually using ESG, but just like low key already kind of like trying to implement parts of like the dimensions. Like as I said, like in the E dimension of the ESG, we are part of the Leaders for Climate Action, amongst others. We invested in one which helps you basically, measure and track. And there, like I think like my ideal goal would be, to also lead by example, to basically measure, reduce, as well as offset as a fund ourselves, and then basically to transport that spirit into our portfolio companies. And this is like on the E dimension. On the S dimension, like for example, like as I said, run by, like our fund is run by 2 women. We have, different nationalities. More than 60% of our fund is female. And like we also have like one, so we use Affinity as one of the CRM, and there you are relatively flexible to incorporate like multiple data. And like one of the data is like basically to basically track like whether like what kind of like background the founders are, pretty much. And then to basically see, but this is like a very nascent field, right? We are talking about like an effort which was incorporated basically like last year. And moving forward, we hope like we can get a lot of data which we can use in order to basically improve our investment decisions and see like how we can work on our shortcomings, pretty much.
Excellent. That sounds great. Cool. Would you, so maybe turning a little bit the attention to what impact, how you kind of, whether you see that there's something like an impact premium maybe on companies right now. So really talking about the relationship between the value of a company and the impact it has in the world. There are some theories that argue that, and I mean that this is most notably driven by the more macro investors. They want to see more sustainable and more kind of ESG focused strategies for, say, publicly traded companies, because they say, well, if you don't do that, then you have a problem with attracting, motivating, retaining talent, or you might actually be vulnerable to regulation and kind of and taxes. You might lose the loyalty of your customers, and so as a result, in a way, the valuation of a large company can shrink if they actually don't take their impact seriously. Do you see a similar dynamic for startups? And as a result, do you think investors should pay more for companies that can actually prove that they have a positive impact?
Yeah. I think like here, ideally, and I think like it will be, reality in the future, hopefully, that sustainability will be viewed similarly to security. Like, it's baked in, it's somehow like required. And I think like every company needs to have it baked in and as one of their core values and one of their operating principles. And if you don't kind of like, if something happens, like similar to the security, everybody expects it, right? You don't necessarily put this as like one of your, USPs in your landing page anymore. It's somehow, expected. And if you don't guarantee that level of security, the value of your company gets deducted. And similarly to sustainability, I see, due to the regulatory tailwinds, due to public interest, I see a very similar dynamic. Like if a company cannot, fulfill certain dimensions of ESG, the value of the company will be deducted automatically. And this is like, a future which I definitely see and I hope for pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, I would subscribe to that as well. And I think there are, again, two dimensions. Like one is ESG within the team, like how does the company operate, how's the team structured, etc. And the second is what the company actually does. But I agree with Viet. I think it will be baked in. It will be a core element of any company, hopefully in the future. And I don't think valuation will be increased, but it will just be expected. At least I hope so.
Oh, great. And so would you then recommend, I mean, in terms of maybe, I mean, impact measurement is a little bit of a loaded term, but how should companies go about now thinking about, like in a way creating that type of security and assurance for their stakeholders? What are there like a set of indicators that you would recommend to already start tracking now that you think will become important in any case? And what type of maybe disclosures do you think even smaller companies should start making? Because they're also overworked, right? Like they have a lot of things on their plate. So why is it so important for them to kind of take that time and create those disclosures?
I think similar to Viet. So I hope I pronounce your name correctly, by the way. I keep on.
Perfect. Love it.
I think similar to you, I think reporting on disclosing ESG is moving from a nice to have to a must have, very much like financial reporting. But the big question, as you said, Vlad, is like what should we report on? I think it really varies on the type of company, the size of the organization, etc. So I don't have these are the top things everyone needs to report on. I think Vlad, you're probably a much better person to ask that question. But there are basic things like starting with the team. What's the diversity within the leadership team? Not just gender, but also background, because we have studies that show the leadership's diverse, chances that the rest of the organization will be much more balanced, much higher. I'm maybe you guys have ideas for the top 10 things that everyone should be reporting on.
Yeah, I think like also touching on the top 10 things. I think like not only like the minimum requirements of basically disclosing information with regards to ESG will not only be shaped by regulatories, I believe, but also similar to security, there will be like a little bit of social proof and social pressure kind of things that you basically as a, let's say like as a startup, you just like look like what are the security measures other companies are undertaking. Like, for example, like you need to basically, like, for example, you're an API first company, right? There's like always like a checklist of, 10 points, which you have like basically kind of like put a check mark on. For example, is it, protected via password, etc. And similar to that, not only driven by, as I said, regulatories, you will also like, copy successful pioneers in the realms of ESG. How do they do it? And then basically kind of like, bake it into your companies too. And I think like those two kind of pillars will be the future of like how companies, operate.
Fantastic. No, that makes a lot of sense. Great. I mean, maybe taking one step back. So giving all of which we discussed, right? If you would now kind of give some advice to entrepreneurs building impactful companies, what do you think should be, what should they think about? What in terms of the pitch, in terms of kind of raising funding, in terms of the KPIs that you might be interested in, what would be your advice to them?
So, sorry, I was trying to find the unmute and mute button. There's a construction site underneath my apartment. So yeah, that's why. So basically, I think here, there shouldn't be too many differences to, other, like, regardless of sustainability, social or like any other, dimension and factors of ESG. I think like it's always the same, like basically, build something that, people need and would pay for. I think like that's like the overarching, criteria, I would say, I'd put as like the minimum requirement. And also like I'd say like when I was founding a startup in sustainability myself, I asked for a lot of advice, and I think like and this also kind of mixes in with like another quote I heard from Scott Belsky, the CPO of Adobe, who said that unfortunately humans, they have three sins, or the three main sins, which is vanity, laziness, and selfishness. And like that particular advice from another entrepreneur back in the days was like, yeah, people are just like lazy as fuck. You just like need to basically provide something for them which is frictionless, but still like have like maybe like a sustainable twist to it. Like for example, he mentioned Everdrop as one of the best examples. You can still kind of like do your dishes, but in a more sustainable way, without like breaking too many friction layers for the users, and can still be like very sustainable, or like make the users feel sustainable. And I think like this, even though a little bit sad, but I think like it's also very human, that you need to basically consider the human factors in with regards to switching to a better reality, a better future too. And so in order to create a product that people need and also people are willing to pay for. So that's on that.
Yeah, I would add to that, as like the parameters don't really change the way, at least with VCs look at companies. And as I mentioned, it starts with the team, and it's it's ideally something that people use and love to use, and like lean in to use, not as like a side tool, but something that they use. It's like their go-to thing, like whatever it is. It's like the go-to dishwasher tab or the go-to app on their phone, rather than just one that they use every now and then, but it becomes like a core part of them, and they come back, they stay engaged, they ideally recommend it to friends. So these are all, I think, strong signs that we would be looking out for. And then there's another element that I just pick up on with every single pitch, and especially now that we're in the virtual world, and that's, it sounds like an obvious one, but like presenting with confidence. Like you need to believe in your idea, and even if you don't, like take it, because people will pick up on insecurities. And that's regardless of the idea you're pitching, but like show that you're passionate about what you do, show that you care, and make sure to communicate that. I think that's key, literally.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this great advice. That makes a lot of sense. And if I would allow a quick recap. So I think what we learned is that there is a lot of kind of interest in sustainability and impact related sectors. It's driven just by real needs that need to be solved, real pain points from either customers or businesses or governments that would actually pay for products and services that address the needs that emerge as a result of the world just changing like it ever has. And we are not quite there yet at a kind of, in a way, super sophisticated impact measurement system. It's not 100% still part of, either the due diligence process or the way companies are managed beforehand, but we're seeing the beginning a little bit, to be fair, around the topic of ESG and the question, to what extent are companies actually not doing harm at least? And to what extent are they kind of responsible in terms of, addressing and working with their workers, their communities, and the environment. And this is something that you see more and more funds actually worrying about, both for themselves and also kind of in terms of their portfolio companies. And this might also, I guess, be in a way like the Trojan impact horse that would allow kind of maybe also more and more of those kind of impact measurements to be part of the kind of discussion of VCs. I think this is also like a great segue maybe to our webinar in 2 weeks, because I think there are now even, you would probably agree that there are funds who take this kind of level now even one step further and really focus on kind of trying to calculate impact and trying to measure it and trying to kind of like get that impact premium out. So for everyone who's kind of listening, there will be a kind of a third webinar in 2 weeks where we will essentially have a conversation with a new generation of VC funds that were especially founded to invest in those kind of impact verticals, and a little bit see to what extent maybe they have exactly the same incentives as more classical funds, or how they kind of operate and think about it differently. But with all that said, thank you so much, Ines and Viet, for this excellent panel. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you for the great work, and yeah, looking forward to speaking to you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Vlad. Thanks, Ines.
Thanks, Viet. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
So thank you all, and I guess it's time to close the webinar. And thank you. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time, as Wladimir just mentioned. And please just stay behind 1 second so you can answer a short survey on the webinar. Thank you and have a nice evening.